Welcome everyone. We'll start in a minute as more attendees arrive. In the meantime, please take this poll question. So which Citrix products are currently in your IT infrastructure? Citrix Virtual Apps, formerly known as ZApp, Citrix Virtual Desktops, formerly Zen Desktop, Citrix ADC, formerly NetScaler ADC, and the new one, Citrix Cloud. Okay, I will close the poll. Okay, that's a good response. I'll read out the results in a while. So, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're connecting from. To introduce myself, I'm Shashidhar, and I'm part of Citrix Ready technical team. Today, we are here and we will talk about how to maximize your Citrix deployments with insights from ControlUp. And we have Barry Flanagan, Senior Director, America Sales and Channels from ControlUp. So I hope everybody is doing great, and thanks for taking your time for attending the webinar today. And I would like to welcome you all to this Citrix Ready Technical Webinar series, where we showcase how Citrix and our partners have integrated to deliver valuable products and solutions to our common problems which are faced by our customers today. Barry, next slide, please. Thank you. So to talk about Citrix Ready program, I'm sure like most of you might have already heard about this. Citrix Ready is a technical end-to-end technology partner program which showcases and recommends third-party products, its solutions and services which demonstrate compatibility with the Citrix products. We have listed the Citrix Ready verified products on Citrix Ready Marketplace, which could be navigated by citrixready.citrix.com, wherein you can find the solutions, the verified solutions recommended by Citrix, and these are the partner products, which makes customers, which is a single stop shop for the customers to make the purchase decision. So for more information on the Citrix Ready program, you could navigate to citrix.com/partnerprograms/Citrix Ready. Next slide, please. So Citrix has, in the recent years, evolved a lot, and now Citrix has moved on to the cloud, and our entire workspace services portfolio is also available in the form of Citrix Cloud Services. These cloud services, which are readily available to consume, in most cases, all you need to do is subscribe and activate them. The benefit to you is that the core infrastructure that you would typically, wherein you install, manage, you have to do some upgrades and maintain yourself, is now managed as a part of your service. So most companies which are on a cloud journey and need a better way to provide the users with access to the apps, data, and services, all that they need to do, and in a better way for IT to provision, manage, and secure all of it. So it is probably not surprising to you that 90% of the companies now will be using public cloud solutions, maybe with an average of about like 4 to 5 cloud apps. And it is projected that about 52% of workloads will be on the cloud by maybe like a couple of years from now. And our cloud transformation isn't just about making our independent products available as cloud services. We also unify our products into an integrated portfolio of services more holistically that addresses the needs of today's hybrid and multi-cloud IT environments. So what this means for you is a better way to provide any service to any user that is simple, fast, secure, and adaptable. So Citrix administrators just use a single management pane to deliver unified and reliable access to the applications, any network or data when the employees need this. Next slide, please. So Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktop Service was one of the component of the Citrix Cloud, and Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktops, which is the newer name for Citrix XenApp and XenDesktop. Whether this is on-prem or this is on the cloud, this is a central component of the Citrix workspace. And I would say it empowers how employees work, and it empowers businesses to operate and expand in new ways. So as its very core, if you think about what centralizing your apps and desktops and then providing secure remote access from any device enables, this enables you to embrace BYOD or low cost endpoints, which also empowers your employees to work from anywhere, which is the key to a healthy work-life balance. So Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktops really empower your business to grow, to hire remote employees, to expand to branch offices anywhere in the world, all while providing an optimal user experience. And I would say it just by giving your IT department a lot of flexibility on how to implement Citrix solutions to best fit your company needs. So here are a few more poll questions, but before that, let me announce the results of the earlier poll which we posted. So 86% say they are using Citrix Virtual Apps, 73% say they are using Citrix Virtual Desktops, 54% use Citrix ADC, and 8% are on Citrix Cloud. So let's see how ControlUp is helping us with this. And before that, we will just go ahead and launch a poll question to get more understanding about the concerns we have. So which is a greater concern for your current Citrix deployment? Is it scalability? Is it ongoing support costs? Or is it downtime or the user experience? Okay, we are getting pretty good response. Okay, I will give 5 seconds and then I'll close the poll now. Okay, so 17% say scalability, 9% say ongoing support costs, 7% says downtime, and 67% say user experience. So to follow with that, let me ask one more poll question. Which of the following do you think best describes how appropriately CPU and RAM are provisioned to your virtual machines? The options are: more VMs are right-sized, many VMs are over-provisioned, some VMs are over-provisioned, some VMs are under-provisioned, and I don't know.
And Shashi, if I could add, I would say that this is targeted at, obviously the Citrix focused virtual machine. So your Citrix virtual desktops and any VMs where you're running Citrix virtual apps.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that, Brad. Right. Okay, so let me close the poll. So I think it's a mix of everything. 31% say most VMs are right-sized. 23% say many VMs are over-provisioned. 23% say some VMs are over-provisioned. 10% say some VMs are under-provisioned. So with that said, and with those poll questions, let me hand it over to Barry. And before I hand it over, I just want to mention that there will be a question and answer session at the end of this webinar. So please post your questions in the Q&A section in the GoToWebinar chat window, and then we'll take this up at the end. So without any further delay, please welcome Barry.
Thank you so much, Shashi. I appreciate that. So as Shashi said, I am Barry Flanagan. I lead America's sales with ControlUp, and I'm going to be leading this portion of the webinar. So what we're going to go through today, we'll do a very brief section on what is ControlUp. I'll do a short demo, and based on the polling results, most of you seem to be interested in user experience. I will show a couple of things briefly about how we can help you troubleshoot user experience. Then we'll dive down into the insights and research that we've put together specifically for Citrix customers for this webinar. So we'll first talk about Citrix Virtual App sizing and provisioning. Then we'll go into Citrix Virtual Desktop sizing and provisioning. And then we have some interesting data that we've just started collecting on application process and version data. And what we're going to do there is look at some very popular apps and show what our data shows, the difference in CPU and RAM for those different apps. And the point of showing that data is to help you understand there can be some substantial differences when you go from one version to the next version that can obviously impact not only stability, which I'm sure many of you already worry about stability, but they actually can have a significant impact on scalability, either positively or negatively as you go through this app. So we'll go through that and show you some of that actual data that we found throughout our customer set. So let's start off with what is ControlUp. So the way I like to describe ControlUp is a troubleshooting and fix tool that does real-time monitoring. There's a lot of monitoring tools out there today that collect an enormous amount of data. A lot of them give you a lot of reports and things of that nature. But in general, many of the monitoring tools just kind of overwhelm you with data. What ControlUp is focused on is giving the data for a purpose. So you can actually leverage that data and focus on troubleshooting and fixing problems as they arise. So the first point is we track a wide variety of infrastructure metrics in real time, not every few minutes. And let me explain what I mean by that. If you look at many of the popular tools for monitoring Citrix, they collect data typically around 5 minutes. Some are around 1 minute, but most collect around 5 minutes. So if you think about that, if you've ever watched Task Manager or Perfmon, you know that peaks and valleys are very common in infrastructure metrics. It'll go up, it'll go way down, it'll go up again, and that's very common. ControlUp collects data for our real-time console every 3 seconds. And in my experience, that makes a big difference. If you're collecting data every 5 minutes, it's very possible you're going to miss a lot of those peaks and valleys. So that's why we're focused. We collect data so frequently so we can help you capture those peaks and valleys, because those peaks and valleys are critical to the next point, troubleshooting. If you really want to troubleshoot and know what's going on in your environment right now, you need to capture those peaks and valleys. And that's what ControlUp is focused on. With our virtual export capabilities that we've been building into ControlUp, we're focused on helping you rapidly troubleshoot, isolate the problem, do remediation to determine what's working, what's not working in your environment, and find out how you can fix it. And then the final one is triage and fix. So there are a number of actions built right into our console. We also have a capability that we call script-based actions. It allows you to import PowerShell and VB scripts and do a lot of fixing right from our console. And we have a number of people on our team that are focused specifically on that, and we're doing a lot more of that. We've been adding a lot more Citrix-focused scripts in the last few months. There's been a recent blog post on citrix.com that we did about our analyze logon duration script. We have another one coming up about some process scripts that we have. So we're really focused on helping you get advanced capabilities and leverage the power of the script-based actions. Of course, you can create your own, but the great majority on there are built by experts at ControlUp, and we're taking feedback from our customers to help you leverage those scripts to make the tool even more powerful. And then finally, the last point is it's not about what ControlUp does, it's about what it does for you. And that's ultimately help you cut costs, decrease downtime, and raise the ROI on your Citrix deployments. So let's go in and talk about that. So first, we'll start off with the architecture. So you see here the architecture, there's 2 ways that we collect data. So the first way that we collect data is through APIs. So we do an API integration with Citrix Hypervisor. We do it with VMware, with Nutanix and Hyper-V. We also have an API integration with virtual desktop sites. We have an API integration with Amazon Cloud. We have an API integration with a NetScaler ADC. And then we have an agent that you can run either in your Windows VMs or physical devices, both server and desktop versions. So that's how we collect data. You see that here. And then there's two components that you would run in your environment. So the one you see here on the left is the ControlUp console. That's an NRAM database. We'll show you that console in the demo. There's no setup, it's just an executable, sets up an NRAM database for you. And then once you have that up, there's another executable called the ControlUp monitor. You actually install it from the console. It's essentially the same executable, but it's headless, and it collects the historical data that we then go and report up into our cloud instance. So this is our hybrid cloud installation. Probably 90-95% of our customers use this. We do have an on-premise option available as well. So with that, I'm going to jump into the demo. So let me get out of PowerPoint here. All right, I have the demo up and running. So this is our real-time console. As I said, this is an NRAM database. You have a number of things that you can look at here. Here's our cloud, our folder structure. You can see all the objects that you have, and here's how you do views. You can look at it from a folder perspective: hosts, computers, sessions, processes, accounts, applications, storage, and NetScaler ADCs. So I'm going to do a quick user experience troubleshooting demo. So I've selected sessions. What I'm going to do up here is go into our column presets. We have a lot of presets available, and you can create your own. And I'm going to select a preset for user experience score. So since I have this sorted already by user experience score, you can see I have two users right here that are in the red for user experience score. I can see they both have a high login duration, and because I've pulled over the login duration variables that we look at, I can see right away these two users, their problem is group policy. Now, in my experience in talking to customers, and I was with Citrix for almost 12 years, a lot of people assume that when there's a long login duration, that the problem is going to be with profile load time. But what we find in our data is 26% of the typical login duration is taken by group policy, whereas 11% is typically taken by profile load time. So one of the things we're going to do here is we're going to figure out exactly which group policy is causing the problem for these two users. And we're going to do that by leveraging something I mentioned earlier, the script-based action. So with a script-based action, it's going to allow us to invoke a PowerShell script that we wrote that analyzes GPO load times, and it'll pass the variables for you. So what I'm going to do is go over here and select these two users. All right, so I have them selected. I'm going to right-click, go to script-based actions, and go to Analyze GPO Extension Load Time. So that showed up on my other monitor, so let me drag that over so you can see it. So the first user here, you can see their total GPO load time was 41 seconds. You can see here at the top, this drive map GPO took 38 seconds. So now we know exactly which GPO is the problem for this first user. So we can go into edit that GPO, see if there's been some recent changes that may be causing that problem. And then we go into the second user. Their GPO load time was 34 seconds. And we can see here the same policy, the drive map policy, and it took for this user 32 seconds. So now we know exactly which group policy caused the problem, and we can go into edit those group policies, see if there's some recent changes or something that caused that problem for those specific users. So we do have another user here that's got a red user experience score. That's Julie. She actually has an even higher login duration, but in her case, it's not group policy load time. It actually is profile load time. So we're going to do, the first thing we're going to look at is see how big our profile is. If something changed recently in our profile to cause it to take a long time for that profile to get copied down. So I'm going to run the script-based action for calculate user profile size. Let me drag that over so you can see it on this main monitor here. So that's running. So it went and looked at our profile, then looked at all the different folders in Julie's profile. You can see our profile is not huge. It's 101 meg here, but I can see right away, while she's only got 44 meg in our download folder, it's over 25,000 files. So something is definitely happening there. That's taken a long time to load. So now I have a much better idea what's going on with this user's profile and why it's taking so long to load. So I know really what I want to do with that problem, get Julie on the phone and find out why she's downloading so many small files all at once. That's definitely impacting her profile, and get her to move those over to a home drive. All right, so that's a quick user experience demo. The next thing that I want to do is go into show you some of our historical reports that are ways that we collect data and show you that So you can leverage that when you want to go look at the data that we're going to talk about in the next following 2 sections. So the first one I want to look at here is what we call Top Insights. These are our 3 virtual expert reports. So what Top Insights does is it looks at users, computers, hosts, and applications, and it looks at them as a snapshot of what happened in the previous day. So today is Tuesday. So this is looking at a snapshot of what happened on Monday, yesterday, and comparing it to previous Mondays, because we find from feedback from our customers that what happens in your IT infrastructure on Monday may be substantially different from what typically happens on a Wednesday or a Friday. So we allow you to compare those individual days. So you can see here under users, it's going to give you, the slowest logons. There's definitely a user here, Jump Slow. That's one of the users we looked at for group policy. He's had as high as a 51-second logon time. Look at top CPU consuming users, number of user sessions, peak concurrent sessions, things of that nature. Same thing for computers and host and application. So one of the things I want to point out are the benchmarks that we provide you. And I find that once customers really understand this, they really like this benchmark capability. So you see I have a number of places here where we have a metric and then we have 2 values beneath it. So in this case, we're looking at host disk IOPS utilization. So in our San Jose demo environment, yesterday we used 2,995 IOPS. That is compared to our historical average on Mondays. That was 39% lower than we typically use on a Monday. And this is the global benchmark. That's actually, so 29.95 is 22% lower than the average IOP utilization for hosts across all ControlUp hybrid cloud customers. So it allows you to compare what's going on in your environment to a wide range of other environments. So you can get a baseline and see if you're, in line or way out of line, either for the good or for the bad. You can see we have a number of them here available. You can see down here for computers, this is RAM utilization. We use all the VMs and computers in our environment that we're monitoring. Average RAM utilization yesterday was 39%. That's 4% higher than we typically have on Mondays and 29% higher than the global RAM utilization benchmark. So you see there are a number of different things there to give you some real insight into what's going on in your environment and how it compares to other customers. So the next report I'll bring up is what we call the environment assessment. This is one of the reports that we added, I believe it was in April or March of this year. This one's been really popular with a lot of customers. So what it does is go out over a minimum of 2 weeks. We like to collect 30 days worth of data, but it needs a minimum of 2 weeks worth of data. It goes on and gives you a baseline of what's going on in your environment. So it'll count up your total host, your virtual CPU to physical CPU ratio across your host. You can see ours is 2.78. Total VMs, managed computers, all those things at the top. And then we look some deeper dive into your host. We see your average CPU utilization, average RAM, average IOPS, average network. We go into host versions. And same thing for computers and VMs. We look OS distribution. We have some session resource trends. So how many active sessions typically have? How does login duration vary over time? And what's the average across the environment? Same thing for bandwidth and latency. Look at applications, top 10 by popularity. Drill down into your session count and do it by session status. So what's active, idle, disconnected. And a number of other metrics that you have here. And down here at the bottom, this is very popular, where you look at top consumers by resource. So host, top CPU, RAM, disk network. And then for computers and VMs, RAM, disk IO, network, which ones have low space. Similar for users, one thing a lot of people like to look at is login duration there, and then applications as well. So that's the environment report, environment assessment. The last one I'll mention here is the sizing recommendations. So the sizing recommendations, what this does, and we're actually going to talk about this, looks at how your VMs across your environment are provisioned. So the idea is to look at average and peak CPU and RAM utilization and determine if your VMs are right-sized, over-provisioned, or under-provisioned. We find when looking at not only our own demo environment, but across a wide range of customer environments and aggregated data, that most VMs are over-provisioned, both for virtual desktops and for servers that are virtualized. So you see here in our environment, 72% are over-provisioned with respect to CPU, 66% with respect to RAM. And then you can drill down here at the bottom. If I scroll down here, I'm going to sort this by RAM recommendation. See this first VM here has 16 gig of RAM. It's recommending we remove 10. So here's the actual data, and it says we have 2 virtual CPUs that only need 1. So on CPU, the average CPU utilization is 18%. We never use more than 22% at 95 percentile. And then on RAM, we average 2 gigabyte of RAM usage in this VM, and at 95 percentile, we're at 3 gigabytes. So it has 16 gig of RAM. It's recommending you give it some overhead, and you can save 10 gig of RAM in this VM. Now, one thing I want to stress when you run this report, it's very important that you run it to capture the peaks that happen in your environment. So whether those peaks are end of the week, end of the month, the middle of the month, end of the quarter, end of the year, whenever that happens, it's important that you capture those peaks so that you understand that you're getting relevant data. So I just want to stress that. That's very important for this report to give you relevant and useful data. All right, so let's jump back into the slides here, and we'll jump down into that data that we've been collecting. So these are what we call notes from the field from real-world Citrix deployments. I will say the great majority of our customers are leveraging Citrix, both virtual apps and virtual desktops, and that's where we've collected this data from specifically. So this is from our hybrid cloud infrastructure. This is anonymized, aggregated infrastructure metric data that we collect across a wide range of customers. There's actually data from a number of different studies we've done. So the total that we've looked at across these are about 1,000 different companies. It's a wide range of industries. I do want to make sure I thank some of the guys that have done this work and really drill down into the data to help pull out the insights for us. Eugene Kaliev, Uzi Haddad, Shaked Markovich, and the people on our data science team have really done a lot of work on these different pieces of research. So I just want to make sure that we thank them for their help. So I do want to mention before we get into some of the data, there is a great article on the Citrix Tech Zone by Nick Rendelin on single server scalability, both for Citrix Virtual Apps and for Citrix Virtual Desktops. We leverage some of this when we look to try to figure out what data that we want to look at. So I highly recommend the article, and you can see the link there. But if you just search Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktop single server scalability, it's one of the first Google hits that you'll find there. So let's jump into the Citrix Virtual Apps data. So what you see here is we did an analysis of what we found: 6,545 hosts that were running Citrix Virtual Apps as a VM. And we looked at the CPU configuration. So what we find, and you see the data here, percentiles are on the y-axis, core CPU cores, physical CPU cores are on the x-axis. So 73% of the customers that we have, they have between 16 and 32 cores on their hypervisors that are running Citrix Virtual Apps. So that's the most common you see. 20 physical cores is most common, 24, then 16, and then 32 and 28. I do want to stress these are physical cores. Of course, you can leverage hyper-threading to have logical cores, which will double the number of logical cores that you have. But these are the physical cores that we found in the environment. All right, so next we looked at RAM configuration. So again, 6,545 hosts. In the RAM, there's actually a lot less variability. So we find 70% of these hosts have between 256 gigabyte and 512 gigabyte of RAM. So that's typically what we find. You see a few less are at 768 and 192, but that between 256 and 512 seems to be the sweet spot. Next, we started looking at the VMs per host, peak users per host, and the virtual to physical core ratio. So what we find on average VMs per host, it's 13.5. The median is 9. So 13, around 13 or 14 Citrix Virtual Apps VMs on a host. But there are some customers that skew the numbers a little high for the average, so that's why we show the median here. The median is 9. The average peak users per host is 74.99, so about 75 users per host. The median is 52.5. And then average physical or virtual to physical core ratio, it's 1.77. the median is 1.4. So I added some additional data here on the side. So one of the things, if you look at Nick Rennelin's article, he says the magic multiplier for users per core is 10. So you want to be around 10 for Citrix Virtual Apps. What we find in our data, customers are following that advice. 97% of all the hosts that we found were at 10 users per core or less. So it was very rare to find someone exceeding that, though we did find some examples. The second bullet point you see there, max users to core ratio was 38.28. That's quite impressive scalability there. 919 users on 24 cores is what we found in the data. And then the max VM to core ratio, as you recall, the average was 1.77. The max that we found is 4.63. And Nick recommends in his article that you keep that around 2 to 1. So the average was right in line with Nick's recommendations, though there are some customers that are getting much higher, as you can see here. So next, I want to talk about RAM provisioning and utilization. And this is something, if I go back to when I talked about the sizing recommendations report, this is something where we find that there's a substantial opportunity for cost savings. It's ironic when you look at the data that when you think about the purpose of virtualization from the very beginning, when server virtualization first came out, especially, the goal was there are a lot of physical servers that were massively underutilized because people were planning for peaks, and it turns out oftentimes the peaks weren't nearly as high as they were planned for. So physical servers were massively underutilized, and the goal of server virtualization is allow you to utilize much more of those physical servers, so you can save on physical servers, which means, of course, you save on power and space and cooling. But what we're finding is there's actually a lot of over-provisioning happening with virtual machines as well. So you see here in this environment, we look at virtual app servers provisioning, the average RAM provisioning ratio is 53%. So what that means is if there's 1,000 gigabyte of RAM in a host, typically they're only provisioning half of that to the VMs. And then you look at the average RAM utilization ratio, it's 25%. So only 1/4 of the RAM in the VMs are actually being utilized. So there's an opportunity for a lot of savings. You can see here, 6% of all hosts had overcommitted RAM. And there are obviously some features built in some hypervisors that allow you to do that. But more than half the hosts were unprovisioned, did not provision half the memory in the host. 93% of the hosts, more than half the RAM installed was not utilized at all. So there's obviously some opportunity for savings. If you go and analyze this data, especially, I can't stress enough the importance of capturing the peaks in your environment, so you make sure that you don't actually go the other way because you didn't capture the peaks. But I think there is some opportunity for some substantial cost savings by analyzing, how VMs are provisioned and how they're utilized. So I did want to add some data that we did across all server VMs. This is another report. This is on our website now. It's called our ControlUp provisioning report. We did a study of, I believe it was about 148,000 virtual machines, 71,000 of which were server VMs. So this is not just Citrix Virtual App server VMs, but all server VMs. So this is the data that we found on CPU provisioning. So we found the great majority are actually over provisioned. So 93% of server OSs are over provisioned by at least one virtual CPU, and the average was 3.4 virtual CPUs. So that means when you look at the averages and the peaks in those VMs, they're never using all the resources assigned to them, provisioned to them. So there is some substantial opportunity for savings here. And then you find similar numbers on RAM. So when you look at the RAM, you can see the data, how it breaks out. What we find, the key takeaway, 77% of server VMs are over provisioned by more than 2 GB of RAM. And the average underutilized RAM per VM is almost 12 GB. When we looked at this data, I believe it was 948 different companies that we looked across this aggregated anonymized data. And what we found is when you just do the math, take the typical cost of RAM for servers, multiply by those numbers of how much RAM was underutilized, it worked out to about $33,000 in potential savings per company just on RAM assigned to server VMs. So I think there are some really substantial cost savings for you when you start to drill down into this data. So next, let's look at Citrix Virtual Desktops. So one of the things that Nick talks about in his article is what he calls activity ratio. So the way he defines activity ratio is the percentage of Citrix Virtual Desktops that are in use versus the ones that are not in use or idle. There's no users logged in. Or the way we did it in our data, you can see here occupied versus unoccupied. So Nick, and obviously, Nick is one of the senior architects in a Citrix consulting organization, so he sees a lot of different environments. So we found that in the real world, the ratios tend to range between 40 and 60%. So we found similar data as we look across all of our customers. So obviously there's a range, but within individual customers. But when you look across all the different virtual desktops that we looked at, we find that 67% of the time they're in use or by a user, and 33% of the time they're unoccupied. So that's something to think about. When a VM is unoccupied, it's interesting to find how much CPU and RAM does it use when it's unoccupied, and are there opportunities for savings there? Can we design around this idea that more than a third of the time the virtual desktops are going to be unoccupied? How can that impact scalability? When are they unoccupied? It's not always just 8 to 5, especially if you have environments that span multiple time zones. And we're actually looking at some features that we can leverage for you in the future to allow you to take advantage of this specific capability. To analyze when VMs are unoccupied and automatically leverage those resources for other VMs that are occupied. So let's look next at a virtual CPU configuration. So there's a lot less variability when you look at virtual CPU configuration. As you can see here, it turned out 80% of the VMs, virtual desktops that we looked at, had 2 virtual CPUs, and 17% had 4 virtual CPUs, and only 3% fell into other configurations. So 97% total are in the 2 and 4 virtual CPU category. So next, RAM. There was a bit more variability in RAM. So you can see here the most popular configurations. 8 and 6 were right at neck and neck as far as configuration. Then 3 and 4 gigabyte of RAM. And you can see here on the side the most popular configurations in order. First were 2 virtual CPUs and 6 gigabyte of RAM, was 21% of the total that we found across all the virtual desktops. 2 virtual CPUs and 3 gigabyte of RAM was 18% of the total, coming up just behind that. 2 virtual CPUs and 4 gigabyte of RAM, and then finally 2 virtual CPUs and 8 gigabyte of RAM. So those are the numbers that we found across these tens of thousands of virtual desktops that we looked at. So we did look at average CPU virtualization in your virtual desktops. So this is across 38,523 virtual desktops. So the first column you see there at 3.6%, that's the average CPU when there's no user logged into that virtual desktop. So that's kind of the baseline. Next is average CPU when there is a user logged in and that VM is in use. So the average was 10.5. All right, obviously there's quite a bit of variability built into a number like that, but it averaged out to 10.5. The final one is our attempt to determine the amount of CPU utilization per user. And basically what we do here is we take the baseline when there's no, the CPU that the VM's using when there's no user logged in, and subtract that from the CPU when a user is logged in, because obviously that 3.6% is already in place. Anything above that is going to happen when the user session is running. So what we find is it's just under 7%. So it gives you an idea of how the CPU utilization adds up when the user. There is a baseline that's running there, and about double that is what's in use by the user themselves. And then we did the same calculation for RAM. So you can see here the average RAM utilization in desktops is 2.59 gigabyte when it's not occupied. There's no user logged into that virtual desktop. Then what we find is it's 3.65 when a 3.65 gigabyte when a user is logged in. And then we look at the average RAM unused, and so it works out to about 1 gigabyte per user. I did see some data on VMs for servers. The data had we had some challenges with the data, but I found in virtual apps, there are some data I looked at. It wasn't as conclusive, but when I dug down a little, I did find the average RAM per user in Citrix Virtual Apps and VMs was closer to 700 megabyte. So you can see there is actually some substantial savings per user when you're looking at virtual apps. Should be no surprise, obviously, when each user is getting their own server operating system. The delta works out to be about 300 meg there. But when you're looking at Windows VMs for users, virtual desktops, it works out to about 1 gigabyte of RAM specific to the user in those virtual machines. So similarly to what we did on the server side, we did a study across all the virtual desktops that we find in our environment. As I said, the great majority of our customers are using Citrix Virtual Apps, Citrix Virtual Desktops. We do have some customers using, pure RDS, and some using a couple other solutions. The great majority are Citrix. But I wanted to look across that entire infrastructure, and we have this provisioning report that did this, and we looked at virtual desktop provisioning. And what we find, 88% of desktop VMs are over provisioned by more than one virtual CPU, and the average is 1.8 virtual CPUs. So a lot of those people that are provisioning for virtual CPUs are over provisioning. They're according to the data, they're not leveraging all those capabilities. So there is some opportunity for savings there across all this environment. And I believe this was 78,000 VMs, virtual desktop VMs, they were looked at across this data. So obviously this is very statistically relevant data. And next, I want to talk about the virtual desktop over provisioning with respect to RAM. So the numbers are not quite as big on virtual desktops as they are on servers with respect to RAM. You see here, 39% or over provision with 0 to 1 gigabyte, 20 for 1 to 2, 18 for 2 to 4, 7 for 4 to 8. If you look across the key takeaway, 47% of desktop VMs are over provisioned with at least 1 gigabyte, and the average amount of RAM per desktop is about 2 gigabyte. So there is some substantial opportunity for savings here as well. Again, I can't stress enough the importance of looking at the baselines that you have across your environment and making sure that you capture those peaks that are typical in your environment. That's one of the things, if you have the environment assessment and the top insights report from ControlUp, you're going to be able to start capture when those are. Most of you probably already know when the peaks are in your environment. A lot of times that's obviously related to the peaks of the business that you're involved in. Some industries like retail, it's pretty obvious when that peak is, typically, towards the end of the year. But other industries, that could vary a lot, and there could be multiple peaks. So you just want to make sure that you capture that. And that sizing recommendations report that I showed you earlier is definitely where you want to look at for that. And so I put in a couple screenshots just to remind you of that report. You can look here at CPU sizing. On the left, it looks at computers by CPU sizing, tells you how many are over provisioned, right size, and under provision. And then CPUs by utilization, how many you're actually utilizing across your entire environment, how many you're not utilizing. And then gives you some ranges, and does the same thing for RAM. So what we're finding, we're starting to, as this report has become more well-known, more and more customers upgrade, latest versions start using this report. There's a lot of useful data in this report. I do want to stress, though, that in order to leverage this report, you need at least the enterprise version of ControlUp, which has 30 days of data retention. The platinum version has a year of data retention, enterprise has 30. If you're on the pro version, you're not going to really get any value out of this report because pro version only collects 1 day's worth of data. So you want to be at least on the enterprise version of ControlUp. And next, this drills down into specifically, I just wanted to put in a quick reminder, since we've been talking about provisioning and the opportunity for cost savings and potential to avoid downtime and increase your ROI by making sure your environment is right-sized. across all your VMs. So this is a report, the sizing recommendations, that you can use over and over. And as you can see, you can have real data to drill down into specific reports. And a lot of times when I show this to customers, one of the things we hear a lot is they'll say, there's a certain line of business that just constantly is asking for more CPU and more RAM for their VMs. They can't justify it. It's great to have a report like this because now we can go back to them and why do you think you need more CPU and RAM? The data shows you're not using it. And then on the flip side, of course, there are times where they do need more CPU and RAM, and they can actually, with a data like this, they can justify that expense by having the real data over time. So the final thing that we're going to go into is app processes and versions insights. So I'd like to just spend a minute talking about how we decided to come up with this kind of report. We haven't published this research yet. This is one of the first times we're talking about this publicly. But we started to look into things that would impact Citrix server scalability, both on virtual apps and on virtual desktops. So we started looking at, what are the benchmarks, the average CPU and RAM across applications. And so that we could, give customers an idea. If you install these 10 applications, these are what we typically see on CPU and RAM, especially, and potentially other things like IOPS and network as a benchmark for those applications. And what we found when the data science team started digging down into that data, they found that there was massive variability, and they couldn't explain the standard deviations were really, really big. The only way they could clean up the data is when they started looking into specific versions of apps. Then they found it could be a huge difference between different versions. So we want to show you some of that data. And obviously, if a new version of an app has a substantial difference in the amount of CPU and RAM that it uses, you can imagine the impact that could have on a Citrix Virtual App Server or on your virtual desktops with respect to scalability. So let's start off with some of the Office apps. So this is Microsoft Excel. So we look at the different versions. So it's interesting to see here, there's not a huge difference in CPU, except with respect to Excel version 12. It did use substantially more than 11 and a lot more than the newer versions. But RAM, you can really see a difference when you go from Excel 11. If you're going from Excel version 11, which I think is a version of Excel in Office 2007, if you go from that to, Excel 16, which is Excel 2016, that's going to be a big impact on your scalability because there's a lot more RAM going on there, a lot more impact on your environment. And even if you go from 11 to 15, there's a big substantial impact there. And similar thing that we found with Word. So you see 11, 12, 15, and 16 are actually very similar in CPU. Word version 14 jumped a bit there. But when you look at Word version 11 and 12 compared to 16, substantially more RAM in use. So if you're not going from every individual version, and we find most customers don't upgrade immediately to the latest version, they usually have a lot of customers tell us they skip a version. You can see there could be a substantial impact on your scalability there from Word. Next, Outlook. So you can see, again, Outlook version 11, which was in 2007, was really efficient with respect to CPU and RAM. But when you look at it compared to 15 and 16, if you're going from that version up to one of these newer versions, that's going to have a significant impact on your scalability for both virtual apps and virtual desktops. We also looked at Internet Explorer. So it's interesting to see how different, we found in the Office apps, it seemed to just go up consistently in CPU and memory, while there were some differences. CPU usage is a lot more variable in IE, where RAM, you can tell it is just in general going up and up and up, though IE version 8 did drop a bit. So you can see, and this is this is real world data from existing customers using this today. So you can see if you're going from IE8 to IE11, there's going to definitely be an impact on RAM. Of course, the websites that your users go to, and more importantly, the plugins that they use will have an impact on that as well. So next, one of the first ones that we found with a huge variability by version was McAfee. So if you look here, you see, and we have a number of customers that are still on McAfee 15.1. I mean, it's amazing to look at compared to the newer versions compared to this older version. A lot more CPU, and while 14 to 15% CPU may not sound like a lot, this is across, potentially, hundreds or thousands of users. So that can really have an impact on your scalability and your cost in your environment across your Citrix infrastructure. So that's definitely something. Your antivirus in general. I had some other antivirus data I felt just using McAfee would prove the point, but we actually found this with a number of different antivirus tools that we looked at. And because there are so many different versions of McAfee is why I had to break them up into 2 slides, because we actually see similar variability, though, across different versions when you look at RAM. So you can see if you're on an old version like 1.5, using a lot of RAM, it dropped for a long time, and then in the last 2 recent versions, it jumped up quite a bit again. So, antivirus, any kind of tools that you're running on your software, not specifically user apps, but tools that you're running in your VMs for security, especially. We saw it with Windows Defender, with Trend. We saw similar with Sophos and others that we looked at. It's definitely something that you want to consider. And then the last one that we'll look at is User Profile Manager. So one thing that's really impressive, and again, there are a lot of versions, so we broke this up, is a great majority of versions of User Profile Manager are extremely efficient when it comes to RAM. There was one version, however, and we do have customers still using 5.6. Obviously, there was an issue with RAM, so it's definitely, there's a compelling reason for you to upgrade to later versions when you're using a User Profile Manager and any other kind of tools that you're going to be running across your virtual apps, servers, or your virtual desktops. And then, just for completeness sake, I included the CPU usage for User Profile Manager. You can see there was an older version that used a lot, but generally it's very efficient across all the different versions. So that's something I think it's important to look at and consider before you upgrade new versions. Don't just look at the impact on stability. Is it stable? Does it work? But look at the impact on CPU and RAM across your environment, because there could be substantial impact either positively or negatively. So it's something you want to consider as you look at upgrading your applications. So that's the time that I have today. Before we pass it off to Shashi and start taking questions, you can leverage ControlUp to track, troubleshoot, and triage your Citrix deployments. We have a lot of customers who have been very successful. We've actually won a Best of Synergy award the last 2 years as a result of that. As you can see, there are opportunities to cut costs, decrease downtime, and raise the ROI of your Citrix deployments, and ControlUp can help you do that. We do have a free 21-day trial. I encourage you to go to ControlUp.com and download that trial. We do have on our support side a getting started guide and some video tutorials, and there is a link there as well to drill down into the research that we've published, and we will continue to publish in the future. So I appreciate you all taking the time and working with us today. And with that, Shashi, let's take some questions.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Barry. Thanks for giving so much insights and giving so much of analytics around ControlUp and what all things you could do. Okay, great. So we do have a couple of questions. So the first one is, does ControlUp monitor application transaction level delays and bottlenecks?
No, we're not an application performance monitoring tool. So we do give you the ability to drill down and find out what DLLs applications load, but we don't get down into the, deep into the applications themselves. We let you track application load time. We'll let you track the infrastructure metrics that applications use. But my advice, if you really need to get deep into an application, especially on the transaction level, and drill down into application components, there are a number of application performance monitoring tools that are out there that are not focused so much on infrastructure, but on the application components themselves. So that would be my advice, to check out some of the, if you just Google APM, there are a number of APM tools that are available today that can really get that level of insight for you.
Okay, thank you. So the next one is, for profile load time data, what does logon duration other represent? I have one user that has 94 seconds load time for it.
So, that's a good question. I wondered the same thing when I first joined ControlUp. So what we show in the real-time console is we show login duration, we show profile load time, desktop load time, group policy load time, then login duration other. So other is, obviously anything that falls outside of those buckets. We do have a great login duration script that can drill down into what you can see in other. So it's a script-based action, and actually I can flip over if I'm still connected. Let me see if I'm still connected to our demo, and I can show you that. So if I go into here to this specific user, let's go with this one. I can run the login duration script. This is an advanced script. One of our guys, Guy Leach, built for us. So this really drills down. There's actually a blog post on Citrix.com that Guy just put together for this. So this drills down. I can tell you, I saw one customer recently that had this, and the turns out what the problem that they had is Office 365 was what was driving a very high login duration for that customer. And the reason that it was is the first time you log into Office 365, it does a lot of stuff to your profile. And what we found is that it actually was stuck in a loop. So that's one of the things that we found from analyzed login duration. It looks like I might have lost my connection. Here, let me try another user. Let's try this user. Another example that I saw recently that our user was running that we found with the analyzed login duration script. So is that certificates. There are some issues with certificates on their server. So this is the output of the analyzed login duration script. So it drills down more. This is obviously a user that we looked at earlier, but this script actually will get down deeper into the problems that you have. This user didn't have any problems outside of those sections that we looked at, but that would be my recommendation, is run this deeper dive analyze login duration script that really goes much deeper beyond the most common components that we see that impact login duration and can help you identify what your problem may be.
Okay, great. Thanks, Barry. Okay, so I have a couple of questions which is similar, I think. So what is the latest version in the ControlUp?
All right, good question. So to give you exactly the latest version, let's go into help about here in our demo. So 7.2.1.13 is the version that we have here. There might be one newer than that, but 7.2 is the high level version. We do have a new version coming up, 7.3. We're adding some additional components. We're going to add agentless Linux monitoring for Linux VMs. And we're also going to add vSAN integration. Well, we find a large percentage of Citrix customers leverage VMware on the hypervisor side, and hyperconverge has also obviously always been popular with Citrix customers. That's why we support Nutanix. So vSAN is another hyperconverged solution, so we're monitoring that. We do have some big features coming next year. We talked about script-based actions. We're adding a lot more script-based actions that are Citrix specific, and we're going to add the ability to automate script-based actions. So for certain scenarios, you'll be able to go and set it up so it not only identifies that there's a problem, but runs a specific script that you specify. They'll automatically fix that problem for you. So that's some big things that we have coming next year. But 7.2 is the latest version.
Okay, great. So we have a few more questions in line, but considering the time, I will go with one last question and then we will conclude this webinar. So the last one is, when will the Top Insights dashboard be available for IOP?
Available for IOPS?
Yeah, IOPS. Yeah.
So we actually can look in, if I just click here, it'll open and log me in. We actually can look, we look at IOPS already in Top Insights, but we do it by, so you can see here, we're looking at IOPS for host here. And, the benchmarks, I actually talked about this during the demo. And if you look over here under computers, we have it, the IOPS for this is obviously physical computers and VMs. We have IOPS there as well. And we also have it over here by apps. So top disk by app, top apps by disk IOPS. So we have a number of different ways that we can look at IOPS today. And we are looking at adding more things specific to storage. But that is what we have today. We're always looking to add more reports. I will say another thing that we have planned is, from what I found in the time that I've been at ControlUp, a lot of customers, once they understand these benchmarks, really like the benchmarks. So we're looking at adding more and more benchmarks so you can compare your environment against the past in your environment, but also against other similar customers. So one of the things we're looking at with the benchmarks is giving you the ability to filter those benchmarks by, by industry, by infrastructure type, and by company size. So a number of different things. There's a number of different filters that we're looking to build in that we'll have in we're planning for a version probably in the first half of next year.
Okay, great. Thanks, Barry, for taking time to answer the questions. And before we conclude, do you have any message to convey to our audience?
Yes, I appreciate everyone taking the time to join us. If you use ControlUp in the past, the product really has grown up a lot in the last year, and we have a lot of big plans coming for next year. So I encourage you to go to ControlUp.com, download the 21-day trial. You can download, get it set up in a very short period of time. Most customers do a basic setup in 15 to 20 minutes. So it's very easy to set up, and I think you'll find that we can add a lot of value to your Citrix deployment. So I encourage you to go to ControlUp.com and download that 21-day trial.
Okay. Thanks, Barry. Thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. And if you have any questions or if you need any more information about ControlUp or Citrix Ready, you could reach us at citrixready@citrix.com. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day ahead. This concludes the webinar.